Purgatory, Part 2. Chapter 9. The Pains of Purgatory, Their Nature, Their Rigor, Doctrine of the Theologians, Bellarmine, St. Francis of Sales, Fear and Confidence. There is in purgatory, as in hell, a double pain, the pain of loss and the pain of sense. The pain of loss consists in being deprived for a time of the sight of God, who is in the supreme good, the beatific end for which our souls are made, as our eyes are for the light. It is a moral thirst which torments the soul. The pain of sense, or sensible sufferings, is the same as that by which we experience in our flesh. Its nature is not defined by faith, but it is the common opinion of the doctors that it consists in fire and other species of suffering. The fire of purgatory, say the fathers, is that of hell, of which the rich glutton speaks, quia crucior in hac flamma. I suffer, he says, cruelly in these flames. As regards the severity of these pains, since they are inflicted by infinite justice, they are proportioned to the nature, gravity, and number of sins committed. Each one receives according to his works. Each one must acquit himself of the debts which he sees in himself charged before God. Now these debts differ greatly in quality. Some, which we have accumulated during a long life, have reached the 10,000 talents of the gospel, that is to say, millions and tens of millions, whilst others are reduced to a few farthings, the trifling remainder of that which has not been expiated on earth. It follows from this that the souls undergo various kinds of sufferings, that there are innumerable degrees of expiation in purgatory, that some are incomparably more severe than others. However, speaking in general, the doctors agree in saying that the pains are most excruciating. The same fire, says St. Gregory, torments the damned and purifies the elect. Quote, almost all theologians, unquote, says Bellarmine, quote, teach that the reprobate and the souls in purgatory suffer the action of the same fire, unquote. It must be held as certain, writes the same Bellarmine, that there is no proportion between the sufferings of this life and those of purgatory. St. Augustine declares precisely the same in his commentary on Psalms 37. Lord, says he, chastise me not in thy wrath, and reject me not in those whom thou hast said, go into eternal fire. But chastise me not in thine anger. Purify me rather in such manner that this life that I need not be purified by fire in the next. Yes, I fear that fire which has been enkindled for those who will be saved. It is true, but yet so as by fire. They will be saved, no doubt, after the trial of fire, but that trial will be terrible. That torment will be more intolerable than all the most excruciating sufferers in this world. Behold what St. Augustine says, and what St. Gregory, Venerable Bede, St. Anselm, and St. Bernard have said after him. St. Thomas goes even further. He maintains that the least pain of purgatory surpasses all the sufferings of this life, whatsoever they may be. Pain, says Blessed Peter Lefebvre, is deeper and more acute when it directly attacks the soul and the mind than when it reaches them only through the medium of the body. The mortal body, the senses themselves, absorb and intercept a part of the physical, even of moral pain. The author of the Imitation explains this doctrine by a practical and striking sentence. Speaking in general of the sufferings of the other life, there, he says, 1 hour of torment will be more terrible than 100 years of rigorous penance done here. To prove this doctrine, it is affirmed that all the souls in purgatory suffer the pain of loss. Now this pain surpasses the keenest suffering. But to speak of the pain of sense alone, we know what a terrible thing fire is, how feeble soever the flame which we enkindle in our houses, and what pain is caused by the slightest burn. How much more terrible must be that fire which is fed neither with wood nor oil, and which we can never be extinguished. Enkindled by the breath of God to be the instrument of his justice, it seizes upon souls and torments them, that with incomparable activity. That which we have already said, and that we still have to say, is well qualified to inspire us with that salutary fear recommended to us by Jesus Christ. But lest certain readers, forgetful of the Christian confidence which must temper our fears, should give themselves up to excessive fear, let us modify the preceding doctrine by that of another doctor of the Church, St. Francis de Sales, who presents the sufferings of purgatory soothed by the consolation which accompany them. Quote, "We may," unquote, says this holy and amiable director of souls, quote, "draw from the thought of purgatory more consolation than apprehension. The greater part of those who dread purgatory so much think more of their own interest than the interests of God's glory. This proceeds from the fact that they think only of the sufferings without considering the peace and happiness which are there enjoyed by the holy souls. It is true that the torments are so great that the most acute sufferings of this life bear no comparison to them. But the interior satisfaction which is there enjoyed is such that no propensity nor contentment upon earth can equal it. The souls are in continual union with God. They are perfectly reassigned to his will, or rather, their will is so transformed into that of God that they cannot will but what God wills, so that if paradise were to be open to them, they would precipitate themselves into hell rather than appear before God with their stains, which they see themselves disfigured. They purify themselves willingly and lovingly, because such is the divine good pleasure. They wish to be there in the state wherein God pleases, and as long as it shall please him. They cannot sin, nor can they experience the least movement of impatience, nor commit the slightest imperfection. They love God more than they love themselves, and more than all things else they love him with a perfect, pure, and disinterested love. They are consoled by angels. They are assured of their eternal salvation and filled with a hope that can never be disappointed in its expectations. Their bitterest anguish is soothed by a certain profound peace. It is a species of hell as regards the sufferings. It is a paradise as regards the delight infused into their hearts by charity. Charity, stronger than death and more powerful than hell. Charity, whose lamps are all fire and flame. Quote, "Happy state," unquote, continues the holy bishop, quote, "more desirable than appalling, since its flames are flames of love and charity," unquote. Such are the teachings of the doctors, from which it follows that the pains of purgatory are rigorous. They are not without consolation. When imposing his cross upon us in this life, God pours upon it the unction of his grace, and in purifying the souls in purgatory like gold in the crucible, he tempers their flames by ineffable consolations. We must not lose sight of this consoling element, this bright side of the often gloomy picture which we are going to examine. Chapter 10. Pains of Purgatory, the Pain of Loss. St. Catherine of Genoa, St. Teresa, Father Nuremberg. After having heard the theologians and doctors of the Church, let us listen to the doctors of another kind. They are saints who speak of the sufferings of another life, and who relate that what God has made known to them by supernatural communication. St. Catherine of Genoa, in her treatise on Purgatory, says, quote, "The souls endure a torment so extreme that no tongue can describe it, nor could the understanding conceive the least notion of it, if God did not make it known by a particular grace." Unquote. Quote, "No tongue," she adds, "can express, no mind form any idea of what purgatory is. As to the suffering, it is equal to that of hell." Unquote. Saint Teresa, in the Castle of the Soul, speaking of the pain of loss, expresses herself thus, quote, "The pain of loss, or the privation of the sight of God, exceeds all the most excruciating sufferings we can imagine, because the souls urged onward towards God as to the center of their aspiration are continually repulsed by his justice. Picture to yourself a shipwrecked mariner who, having long battled with the waves, comes at last within reach of the shore, only to find himself constantly thrust back by an invisible hand. What torturing agonies! Yet those of the souls in purgatory are 1,000 times greater." Unquote. Father Nuremberg, of the Company of Jesus, who died in the odor of sanctity at Madrid in 1658, relates a fact that occurred at Treves, and which was recognized, says Father Rossignoli, by the Vicar General of the diocese as possessing all the characteristics of truth. On the Feast of All Saints, a young girl of rare piety saw appear before her a lady of her acquaintance who had died some time previously. The apparition was clad in white, with a veil of the same color on her head, and holding in her hand a long rosary, a token of the tender devotion she had always professed towards the Queen of Heaven. She implored the charity of her pious friend, saying that she had made a vow to have 3 masses celebrated at the altar of the Blessed Virgin, and that, not having been able to accomplish her vow, this debt added to her sufferings. She then begged her to pay it in her place. The young person willingly granted the alms asked of her, and when the 3 masses had been celebrated, the deceased again appeared, expressed her joy and gratitude. She ever continued to appear each month of November, and almost always in the church. Her friend saw her there in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, overwhelmed with an awe of which nothing can give an idea. Not yet being able to see God face to face, she seemed to wish to indemnify herself by contemplating him, at least under the Eucharistic species. During the holy sacrifice of the Mass, at the moment of the elevation, her face became so radiant that she might have been taken for a seraph descended from heaven. The young girl, filled with admiration, declared that she had never seen anything so beautiful. Meanwhile, time passed. Notwithstanding the masses and prayers offered for her, that holy soul remained in her exile, far from the eternal tabernacles. On December 3rd, the feast of St. Francis Xavier, her protectress, going to receive communion at the Church of the Jesuits, the apparition accompanied her to the holy table and then remained at her side during the whole time of Thanksgiving, as though to participate in the happiness of Holy Communion and enjoy the presence of Jesus Christ. On December 8th, Feast of the Immaculate Conception, she again returned, but so brilliant that her friend could not look at her. She visibly approached the term of her expiation, Finally, on December 10th, during Holy Mass, she appeared in a still more wonderful state. After making a profound genuflection before the altar, she thanked the pious girl for her prayers and rose to heaven in the company of her guardian angel. Sometime previous, this holy soul, had made known that she suffered nothing more than the pain of loss or the privation of God, but she added that that privation caused her intolerable torture. This revelation justifies the words of St. Chrysostom in his 47th homily, quote, "Imagine all the torments of the world, you will not find one equal to the privation of the beatific vision of God," unquote. In fact, the torture of the pain of loss, of which we now treat, is, according to all the saints and all the doctors, much more acute than the pain of sense. It is true that, in the present life, we cannot understand this because we have too little knowledge of the sovereign good for which we are created. But in the other life, that ineffable good seems to souls what bread is to a man famished with hunger, or fresh water to one dying with thirst. Like health to a sick person tortured by long suffering, it excites the most ardent desires, which torment without being able to satisfy them. Chapter 11. The Pain of Sense, Torment of Fire and Torment of Cold, Venerable Bede and Drithelem. If the pain of loss makes but a feeble impression on us, it is far different with the pain of sense. The torment of fire, the torture of a sharp and intense cold, affrights our sensibility. This is why divine mercy, wishing to excite a holy fear in our souls, speak but little of the pain of loss, but we are continually shown the fire, the cold, and other torments, which constitute the pain of sense. This is what we see in the Gospel, and in particular revelations, by which God is pleased to manifest to his servants from time to time the mysteries of the other life. Let us mention one of these revelations. In the first place, let us see what the pious and learned Cardinal Bellarmine quotes from the Venerable Bede. "England has been witness in our days," writes Bede, "to a singular prodigy, which may be compared to the miracles of the first ages of the Church. To excite the living to fear the death of the soul, God permitted that a man, after having slept the sleep of death, should return to life and reveal that what he had seen in the other world. The frightful, unheard-of details which he relates, and his life of extraordinary penance, which corresponded with his words, produced a lively impression throughout the country. I will now resume the principal circumstances of this history. There was in Northumberland a man named Drithelm, who, with his family, led a most Christian life. He fell sick, and his malady increasing day by day, he was soon reduced to extremity, and died, to the great desolation and grief of his wife and children. The latter passed the night in tears by the remains, but the following day before his interment, they saw him suddenly return to life, arise, and place himself in a sitting posture. At this sight they were seized with such fear that they all took to flight, with the exception of the wife, who, trembling, remained alone with her risen husband. He reassured her immediately, quote, "Fear not, it is God who restores me to my life. He wishes to show in my person a man raised from the dead. I have yet long to live upon earth, but my new life will be very different from the one I led heretofore," unquote. Then he arose full of health and went straight to the chapel or the church of the place, where he remained long in prayer. He returned home only to take leave of those who had been dear to him upon earth, and whom he declared that he would live only to prepare himself for death, and advised them to do likewise. Then, having divided his property into 3 parts, he gave one to his children, another to his wife, and reserved the 3rd part to give in alms. When he had distributed all to the poor, and had reduced himself to extreme indigence, he went and knocked at the door of a monastery, and begged the abbot to receive him as a penitent religious, who would be a servant to all the others. The abbot gave him a retired cell, which he occupied for the rest of his life. 3 exercises divided his time: prayer, the hardest labor, and extraordinary penances. The most rigorous fasts he accounted as nothing. In winter he was seen to plunge himself into frozen water and remain there for hours and hours in prayer, whilst he recited the whole Psalter of David. The mortified life of Drithelm, his downcast eyes, even his features, indicated a soul struck with fear of the judgments of God. He kept a perpetual silence, but on being pressed to relate, for the edification of others, what God had manifested to him after his death, he thus described his vision. Quote, "On leaving my body, I was received by a benevolent person who took me under his guidance. His face was brilliant, and he appeared surrounded with light. He arrived at a large, deep valley of immense extent, all fire on one side, all ice and snow on the other. On the one hand, braziers and cauldrons of fire, on the other, the most intense cold and a blast of a glacial wind. This mysterious valley was filled with innumerable souls, which, tossed as if by a furious tempest, threw themselves from one side to the other. When they could no longer endure the violence of the fire, they sought relief amidst the ice and snow, but finding only a new torture, they cast themselves again into the mists of the flames. I contemplated in a stupor these continual vicissitudes of horrible torments, and as far as my sight could extend I saw nothing but a multitude of souls which suffered without ever having repose. The very aspect inspired me with fear. I thought at first that I saw hell, but my guide, who walked before me, turned to me and said, 'No, this is not, as you think, the hell of a reprobate.' 'Do you know,' he continued, 'what place is this?' 'No,' I answered. 'Know,' he resumed, 'that this valley, where you see so much fire and so much ice, is the place where the souls of those are punished who, during life, have neglected to confess their sins and who have deferred their conversion to the end. Thanks to a special mercy of God, they have had the happiness of sincere repenting before God, of confessing and detesting their sins. This is why they are not damned, and on the great day of judgment will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Several of them will obtain their deliverance before that time, by the merits of prayers, alms, and fasts offered in their favor by the living, especially the virtue of the holy sacrifice of Mass, be offered for their relief." Unquote. Such was the recital of Drithelm. When asked why he so rudely treated his body, why he plunged himself into frozen water, he replied that he had seen other torments and cold of another kind. If his brethren expressed astonishment that he could endure these extraordinary austerities, quote, "I have seen penances still more astonishing," unquote. To the day when it pleased God to call him to himself, he ceased not to afflict his body. Although broken down with age, he would accept no alleviation. The event produced a deep sensation in England. A great number Of sinners, touched by the words of Drithelm, and struck by the austerity of his life, became sincerely converted. This fact, adds Bellarmine, appears to me of incontestable truth, since, besides being conformable to the words of Holy Scripture, let him pass from the snow waters to excessive heat. Venerable Bede relates it as a recent and well-known event. More than this, it was followed by the conversion of a great number of sinners, the sign of the work of God, who is accustomed to work prodigies in order to produce fruits in souls. Chapter 12. Pains of Purgatory. Bellarmine and St. Christine the Admirable. The learned and pious cardinal then proceed to relate the history of St. Christine the Admirable, who lived in Belgium at the close of the 12th century, and whose body is preserved today in St. Trond, in the Church of the Redemptorist Fathers. The life of this illustrious virgin was, he says, written by Thomas de Campre, a religious of the Order of St. Dominic, an author worthy of credit and contemporary with the saint. Cardinal James de Vitry, on the preface to the life of Maria Diogenes, speaks of great number of holy women and illustrious virgins, but the one whom he admired above all is St. Christine. This servant of God, having passed the first years of her life in humility and patience, died at the age of 32. When she was about to be buried, and the body was already in the church resting in an open coffin, according to the custom of the time, she arose full of vigor, stupefying with amazement the whole city of St. Trond, which had witnessed this wonder. This astonishment increased when they learned from her own mouth what had happened to her after her death. Let us hear her own account of it. Quote, "As soon as my soul was separated from my body, it was received by angels, who conducted it to a very gloomy place, entirely filled with souls. The torments which they were endured appeared to me so excessive that it was impossible for me to give any idea of their vigor. I saw them, many of my acquaintances, and, deeply touched by their sad condition, I asked what place it was, for I believed it to be hell. My guide answered me that it was Purgatory, where sinners were punished who, before death, had repented of their faults, but had not made worthy satisfaction to God. From thence I was conducted into hell, and there I recognized among the reprobates some of whom I had formerly known. The angels then transported me into heaven, even to the throne of divine majesty. The Lord regarded me with a favorable eye, and I experienced an extreme joy, because I thought to obtain the grace of dwelling eternally with him. But my heavenly Father, seeing what passed in my heart, said to me these words, 'Assuredly, my dear daughter, you will one day be with me. Now, however, I allow you to choose, either to remain with me henceforth from this time, or to return again to earth to accomplish a mission of charity and suffering. In order to deliver from the flames of purgatory these souls which have inspired you with so much compassion, you shall suffer for them on earth. You shall endure great torments, without, however, dying from their effects. And not only will you relieve the departed, but the example which you will give to the living and your life of continual suffering will lead sinners to be converted and expiate their crimes. After having ended this new life, you shall return here laden with merits.'" At these words, seeing the great advantages offered me for souls, I replied, without hesitation, that I would return to life and that I arose at that same instant. It is for this sole object, the relief of the departed and the conversion of sinners, that I have returned to this world. Therefore, be not astonished at the penances that I shall practice, nor at the life that you will see me lead from henceforward. It will be so extraordinary that nothing like to it has ever been seen. All this was related by the saint herself. Let us now see what the biographer adds in the different chapters of her life. Quote, Christine immediately commenced the work for which she had been sent by God. Renouncing all the comforts of life and reduced to extreme destitution, she lived without house or fire, more miserable than the birds of the air which had a nest to shelter them. Not content with these privations, she eagerly sought all that she could cause her suffering. She threw herself into burning furnaces, and there, suffering is so great a torture that she could no longer bear it. She uttered the most frightful cries. She remained for a long time in the fire, and yet, on coming forth, no sign of burning was found upon her body. In winter, when the Meuse was frozen, she plunged herself into it, staying in that cold river, not only hours and days, but for entire weeks, all the while praying to God and imploring his mercy. Sometimes, whilst praying in the icy waters, she allowed herself to be carried by the current down to a mill, the wheel of which whirled her around in a frightful manner to behold, yet without breaking or dislocating one of her bones. On another occasion, followed by dogs, which bit and tore her flesh, she ran, enticing them into the thickets and among the thorns, till she was covered with blood. Nevertheless, on her return, no wound or scar was to be seen. Such are the works of admirable penance described by the author of the Life of Saint Christine. This writer was a bishop, a suffragan of the Archbishop of Cambrai. Quote, and we have, quote, says St. Bellarmine, quote, a reason for believing his testimony, since he has for guarantee another grave author, James de Vitry, bishop and cardinal, and because he relates what had happened to his own time, even in the province where he lived. Besides, the suffering of this admirable virgin were not hidden. Every one could see that she was in the midst of the flames without being consumed, and covered with wounds, every trace of which disappeared in a few moments afterwards. But more than this was the marvelous life she led for 42 years, after she was raised from the dead, God clearly showing that the wonders wrought in her were by virtue from on high. The striking conversions which she effected, and the evident miracles which occurred after her death, manifestly proved the finger of God, and the truth of that which, after her resurrection, she had revealed concerning the other life. Unquote. Thus, argues Bellarmine, quote, God willed to silence those libertines who make open profession of believing in nothing, and who have the audacity to ask in scorn, who has returned from the other world? Who has ever seen the torments of hell and purgatory? Behold 2 witnesses. They assured us that they had seen them and that they are dreadful. What follows then, if not that the incredulous are inexcusable, and that those who believe and nevertheless negligent to do penance are still more to be condemned? Unquote. Chapter 13. The Pains of Purgatory, Brother Antony Perilla, the Venerable Angela Tolomei. To the 2 preceding facts we shall add a third, taken from the Annals of the Company of Jesus, We speak of a prodigy which was wrought in the person of Antony Perea, brother coadjutor of that company, who had died in the odor of sanctity at the College of Evora in Portugal, August 1st, 1645. 46 years previous, in 1599, 5 years after his entrance into the novitiate, this brother was attacked by a mortal malady in the island of St. Michael, one of the Azores. A few moments after he had received the last sacraments, in the presence of the whole community, who assisted him in his agony, he appeared to breathe forth his soul, and soon became as cold as a corpse. The appearance, though almost imperceptible, of a slight beating of the heart, alone prevented them from interring him immediately. He was therefore left for 3 entire days upon his bed, and his body already gave evident signs of decomposition, when suddenly, on the 4th day, he opened his eyes, breathed, and spoke. He was then obliged by obedience to relate to his superior, Father Louis Pinheiro, all that he had passed within him since his last terrible moments in agony. We here give an abridged account of it, as was written by his own hand. He says, quote, I saw first from my deathbed my father, St. Ignatius, accompanied by several of our fathers from heaven, who came to visit his sick children, seeking those whom he thought worthy to be offered by him and his companions to the Lord. When he drew near to me, I believed for a moment that he would take me, and my heart thrilled with joy. But soon he pointed out to me that of which I must correct myself before obtaining so great of happiness. Unquote. Then, nevertheless, by a mysterious disposition of divine providence, the soul of Brother Perea separated himself momentarily from his body, and immediately a hideous troop of demons rushed towards him, filling him with terror. At the same moment, his guardian angel and St. Anthony of Padua, his countryman and patron, descended from heaven, put to flight his enemies, and invited him to accompany them to take a glimpse of, and taste for a moment, the joys and sufferings of eternity. He adds, quote, they led me by turns towards a place of delights, where they showed me a crown of incomparable glory, but which I had not yet merited, and then to the brink of an abyss where I saw the reprobate souls fall into eternal fire, crushed like the grains of wheat cast upon a millstone that turns without intermission. The infernal gulf was like one of those limekilns, where at times the flames are, as it were, stifled by the mass of materials thrown onto them, but which feeds the fire that may burst forth with terrible violence. Unquote. Led from thence to the tribunal of the sovereign judge, Anthony Perea heard himself condemned to the fire of purgatory, and nothing, he assures us, can give an idea of what is suffered there, nor the state of agony to which the souls are reduced by the desire and the delay of the enjoyment of God and of his sacred presence. When, by the command of God, his soul had been reunited with his body, the renewed tortures of his malady for 6 entire months, with the additional torture of fire and iron, caused the flesh, already incurably tainted with the corruption of his first death, to fall in pieces. Yet not this, nor the frightful penances to which he unceasingly delivered himself, so far as obedience permitted, during the 46 years of his new life, could appease his thirst for suffering and expiation. He said, quote, all this is nothing in comparison to what the justice and infinite mercy of God has caused me not only to witness, but also to endure. Unquote. In fine, as an authentic seal upon so many marvels, Brother Perea discovered to his superior in details the secret designs of Providence regarding the future restoration of the Kingdom of Portugal, more than half a century before it happened. But we may add without fear that the highest guarantee of all these prodigies was the astonishing degree of sanctity to which Brother Pereira ceased not to elevate himself from day to day. Let us relate a similar instance, which confirms in every point that which we have just read. We find it in the life of the venerable servant of God, Angela Tholomé, a Dominican nun. She was raised from the dead by her own brother and gave a testimony of the rigors of God's judgments exactly conformable to the present. Blessed John Baptist Tholomé, whose rare virtues and gift of miracles had placed him on our altars, had a sister, Angela Tholomé, the heroism of whose virtue has also been recognized by the Church. She fell dangerously sick. Her holy brother, by earnest prayer, besought her cure. Our Lord replied, as he did formerly to the sister of Lazarus, that he would not cure Angela, but that he would do more. He would raise her from the dead for the glory of God and the good of souls. She died, recommending herself to the prayers of her holy brother. Whilst she was being carried to the tomb, Blessed John Baptist, in obedience, no doubt, to an inspiration of the Holy Spirit, approached the coffin, and in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, commanded his sister to come forth. Immediately she woke as from a profound slumber and returned to life. That holy soul seemed struck with terror and related such things concerning the severity of God's judgments as make us shudder. She commenced at the same time to lead a life which proved that the truth of her words. Her penance was frightful. Not content with the ordinary practices of saints, such as fasting, watching, hair shirts, and bloody disciplines, she went so far as to cast herself into flames and to roll herself therein until her flesh was entirely burnt. Her macerated body became an object of pity and horror. She was censured and accused of destroying, by her excess, the idea of true Christian penance. She continued, nevertheless, and contented herself with replying, quote, "If you knew the rigors of the judgments of God, you would not speak thus. What are my trifling penances compared with the torments reserved in the other life for those infidelities which we easily permit ourselves in this world? What are they? What are they? Would that I could do 100 times more." Unquote. There is no question here, as we see, of the tortures to which the great sinners converted before the death are subjected, but the chastisements which God inflict upon a servant, religious, for the slightest faults. Chapter 14. Pains of Purgatory. The apparition of Foligno. The Dominican religions of Zamora. The same rigors revealed itself in a more recent apparition, where a religious who died after an exemplary life makes known her sufferings in a manner calculated to inspire all souls with terror. The event took place on November 16, 1859, at Foligno, near Assisi, in Italy. It made a great noise in the country, and besides the visible mark which was seen, an inquiry made in due form by competent authorities established it as an incontestable fact. There was, at the convent of Franciscan tertiaries in Foligno, a sister named Teresa Gesta, who had been for many years mistress of novices, and who at the same time had charge of the sacristy of the community. She was born in Bastia, in Corsica, in 1797, and entered the monastery in the year 1826. Sister Teresa was a model of fervor and charity. We need not be astonished, said her director, if God glorifies her by some prodigy after her death. She died suddenly, November 4th, 1859, of a stroke apoplexy. 12 days later, on November 16th, a sister named Anna Felicia, who succeeded her in office, went to the sacristy and was about to enter when she heard moans which appeared to come from the interior of the room. Somewhat afraid, she hastened to open the door. There was no one. Again she heard moans so distinctly that, notwithstanding her ordinary courage, she felt herself overpowered by fear. Quote, "Jesus, Mary," unquote, she cried. Quote, "What can that be?" Unquote. She had not finished speaking when she heard a plaintive voice accompanied by a painful sigh. Quote, "Oh, my God, how I suffer! Oh, Dio, che peno tanto!" Unquote. The sister, stupefied, immediately recognized the voice of poor Sister Teresa. When the room was filled with a thick smoke, and the spirit of Sister Teresa appeared, moving towards the door and gliding along by the wall. Having reached the door, she cried aloud, quote, "Behold a proof of the mercy of God," unquote. Saying these words, she struck the upper panel of the door, and there left the print of her right hand, burned in the wood as with a red-hot iron. Then she disappeared. Sister Anna Felicia was left half dead with fright. She burst forth into the loud cries of help. One of her companions ran, then a second, and finally the whole community. They pressed around her, astonished to find a strong odor of burnt wood. Sister Anna Felicia told what had occurred and showed them the terrible impression on the door. They instantly recognized the hand of Sister Teresa, which had been remarkably small. Terrified, they took to flight and ran to the choir, where they passed the night in prayer and penance for the departed, and the following morning all received Holy Communion for the repose of her soul. The news spread outside the convent walls, and many communities in the city united their prayers with those of the Franciscans. On the third day, November 18th, Sister Anna Felicia, ongoing in the evening to her cell, heard herself called by her name and recognized perfectly the voice of Sister Teresa. At the same instant, a globe of brilliant light appeared before her, illuminating her cell with the brightness of daylight. Then she heard Sister Teresa pronounce the words in a joyful and triumphant voice, quote, "I died on a Friday, the day of the Passion, and behold, on a Friday, I enter into eternal glory. Be strong to bear the cross, be courageous to suffer, love poverty," unquote. Then, adding affectionately, quote, "Adieu, adieu, adieu," unquote, she became transfigured, and like a light, white and dazzling crowd rose towards heaven and disappeared. During the investigation, which was held immediately, November 23rd, in the presence of a large number of witnesses, the tomb of Sister Teresa was opened, and the impression upon the door was found to correspond exactly with the hand of the deceased. The door, with the burn print of the hand, adds Monsignor Segur, is preserved with great veneration in the convent. The Mother Abbess, witness of the fact, was pleased to show it to me herself." Unquote. Wishing to assure myself that the perfect exactitude of these details related by Monsignor Segur, I wrote to the bishop in Foligno. He replied by giving me a circumstantial account, perfectly according to with the above, and accompanied by a facsimile of the miraculous mark. This narrative explains the cause of the terrible expiation which Sister Teresa was subjected. After saying, quote, "Ah, how much I suffer! Oh, Dio, che peno tanto," unquote. She added that it was for having, in the exercise of her office of sacristan, transgressed some points of the strict poverty prescribed by the rule. Thus we see divine justice punished most severely the slightest faults. It may be here asked why the apparition, when making the mysterious mark on the door, called it a proof of the mercy of God. It is because, in giving us a warning of this kind, God shows us a great mercy. He urges us, in the most efficacious manner, to assist the poor, suffering souls, and who be vigilant in our own regard. Whilst speaking of this subject, we may relate a similar instance which happened in Spain and which caused great rumors in that country. Ferdinand of Castile thus relates it in his History of St. Dominic. A Dominican religious led a holy life in his convent at Zamora, a city of the Kingdom of Leon. He was united in the bonds of a pious friendship with a Franciscan brother like himself, a man of great virtue. One day, when conversing together on the subject of eternity, they mutually promised that, if it pleased God, the first who died should appear to the other to give him some salutary advice. The friar minor died first, and one day, whilst his friend, the son of St. Dominic, was preparing the refectory, he appeared to him. After saluting him with respect and affection, he told him that he was among the elect, but that before he could be admitted to the enjoyment of eternal happiness, there remained much to be suffered for an infinite small faults which he had not sufficiently repented during his life. He added, quote, "Nothing on earth can give me an idea of the torments which I endure, and of which God permits me to give you a visible proof." Unquote. Saying these words, he placed his right hand upon the table of the refectory, and the mark remained impressed on the charred wood as though it had been applied with a red-hot iron. Such was the lesson which the fervent deceased Franciscan gave to his living friend. It was proof not only to him, but to all those who came to see the burnt mark, so profoundly significant, for this table became an object of piety which people came from all parts to look upon. Quote, "It is still to be seen at Zamora," unquote, says Father Rossignoli. Quote, "At the time at which I write, to protect it, the spot has been covered with a sheet of copper." Unquote. It was preserved until the end of the last century. Since then it had been destroyed during the revolutions, like so many other religious memorials.